Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another album of the week. This is episode number 138, and today's episode is well dedicated to the album that you're looking at right now. It is none other than For Those About to Rock. We salute you, as the title says, or at least the lyric says. It is the 8th studio album, but also the 2nd studio album for at least AC/DC, fronted by Brian Johnson, who of course we all know had to replace the late Bon Scott in at least in either February or March of 1980, depending. The reason I say that is because of, again, at least it had to at least been a month or so, of course, after the unexpected passing of Bon Scott. So he replaced him to basically finish up what ended up becoming Back in Black, the album that you can say revived, or really it made AC/DC even bigger. It was one of the main albums that really skyrocketed AC/DC into just superstardom. It was their hugest album. However, at the time, it was considered, it was pretty much a album that saved their career. However, again, while many seem to really look at Back in Black these days as the album that really helped skyrocketed the band even further, I mean, they were getting a lot of good success prior to that, especially with albums like, for example, Let There Be Rock, and at least Power Edge to an extent, and of course Highway to Hell. Highway to Hell being probably the biggest selling of those three albums, which those albums then piggybacked off the success of at least Highway to Hell, and of course Back in Black. But, however, again, many people will look at Back in Black as the album that, it was the album that really saved them, but many people these days look at that album as like their biggest selling record. However, that's probably because of it ended up piggybacking off of technically this album right here. This was the album that really kind of really made the band even more bigger, and that's due to its sales, which I'll eventually get to in this review. And actually, you can't even call this review. This is basically more so of for me personally, a personal look back at this album. So, without further ado, let me get into at least, let's just dive into at least what ended up becoming more so the process for Those About to Rock. While again, Back in Black was serving to be a hot seller, by 1981, you can tell things were going to be very interesting for them. For one, already depending on what time they did, it might have been February or it might have been March, somewhere around there. Or it could have been prior to the release of For Those About to Rock. Atlantic finally decides to release Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, which had for the longest time was only being seen as a slight import in the US, but for the most part it was mostly available officially through worldwide. Basically, again, through into for example, Australia and Europe mostly. I didn't say, I hate the say for example, worldwide, but still it was mostly a European seller, so it never really got to see really a more standard official release over in the States. So since it's been a year since the passing of Bon Scott, Atlantic decided they wanted to keep, I guess you could tell that they wanted to cash in basically on Bon Scott's name, and since really not really a lot of the folks in the United States really got to hear pretty much anything off of Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, maybe a bit of the song, but that's about it, because if they had seen them play in the States here, which I don't know how many times AC/DC actually played the song live, still, everyone got more exposure to that song in the States pretty much around this time period of 1981. And that's because, again, they never got to listen to it on the year that it was released, because in 1976, Atlantic decided to release a version of High Voltage, which was more of a comp that combined two songs from the actual High Voltage album that was released in Australia. And, of course, the rest of it being stuff off of the Australian TNT album. So that's what everyone got to hear of AC/DC in 1976, but they didn't get to hear the actual album that was recorded and released in 1976, because those two were released in 1975, both, again, the Australian High Voltage and the Australian TNT. So they never got to really hear Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap until this year of 1981. So that might have been seen as a way that a little bit of a hurdle for at least Brian Johnson once again, because there was always those crowds that preferred Bon Scott and didn't want to completely accept Brian Johnson as the singer for AC/DC. So that it really kind of more so amplified those crowds in a way. It just to whatever the vigor they had, it just amplified it more. So it might have been seen as a hurdle. That's only considered to be fan theories, at least, of what people think for why. Even though, again, we'll come to find out later when it actually does, when For Those About to Rock does get released, didn't completely hurt it so much. So that's where we're at. One of the biggest hurdles, though, for the band was actually getting to record For Those About to Rock. They were already writing the songs for this album anyways, but one of the biggest hurdles would be for recording it. So this, of course, would end up serving as the final album anyways for Robert Mutt Lange as producer. Again, his third album in with producing the band. Again, since Highway to Hell. However, again, because of this whole recording process, this would serve as his final time producing for AC/DC, because the recording process for this album was obviously, I guess to be really blunt, a pain in the ass. This was very migraine ridden. It was painstaking. It was just frustrating, and it really kind of and it probably added to a lot of the feel for the album itself. We'll get to that. I'll get to that. Still, it was just becoming very tiresome for the band because of, I think it was slated to be recorded in at least June or July. But the problem ended up starting is that because again, the recording process for Robert Mutt Lange was that it wasn't, you can tell that it wasn't so much of AC/DC's vision of what they wanted, the album, the sound, and then it became more so the vision of Robert John Mutt Lange in himself, because of he was thinking of what the album should sound, and that's what the band was pretty much slaves to. I hate to use that word, but it really kind of felt that way, because of they were more so succumbed to pleasing him instead of him kind of trying to please them. So he wanted a certain sound for the album, and that's why the recording process for this album was why it got delayed so much, and why it took a really long time, and why I think the band was getting frustrated and just wanted this album released to begin with. They just want it released. They didn't care how the fuck it ended up sounding. They just wanted this. But Robert Mutt Lange, every time I guess AC/DC would go inside a studio, or they'd pick a studio, to them it would sound great. It would be fine, but it's not the kind of sound that Robert Mutt Lange wanted. So he basically would take the band out of that studio and book for them in another fucking studio, and it kept going on. It just repeated itself, basically. It just repeated itself for each month. So when they finally were, I think we're going to be really happy with the recording style, I guess around August or whatnot, eventually that ended up being cut short, because eventually they had to be at the very first Monsters of Rock. They were the opening band. in August of 1981, being on a bill with like Whitesnake, Blurs to Colt, Slade, Blackfoot, and of course the new wave or British heavy metal band More. They had to be on that tour. They need to be on that show. They were the headlining band, and they had to cut the recording process for those about to rock, so they can at least can make that date for that show. And apparently that also kind of caused some little backstage, or at least personal problems between Malcolm Young and co. a little bit. That's what I've apparently, whatever stories has come out around the time. I think maybe Tony Platt might have been the one that kind of brought up maybe some of it, but it was apparently there was some issues a little bit. I guess that was the beginning of also the Malcolm's alcohol problems were starting to kind of show up during that show. But eventually they got through that show, and I guess you could say they tore the crowd apart basically. So it was still a very good show, and it was still it was a success. But again, eventually, the band then knew that after that entire show was done, they had to, of course, get back to recording this album. And again, that ended up finally taken, after, I guess, several times or several trips to different studios. Because again, Robert Munlang was just not satisfied with what he wanted out of those studios for sound-wise. Eventually, they found a studio, which was in Paris, actually. It was in Paris. It was the Mobile One and Paris. And, of course, the HIS in Paris or something like that. So, they eventually recorded the entire album in Paris. And that was, again, you can tell right here, it actually says how long they took to record this, from May to September. So, they eventually got it done in September. So, eventually it's recorded and immediately ends up being released on November 20th of 1981. And of course, we all know this album had already reached its 40th anniversary on Saturday. So Saturday, this album saw its 40th anniversary, which is all cool and all, which is great. But that's not really the point, I guess, right now for the whole entire episode, because now it's time to just actually get into the album itself, to the track listing, and my overall opinions, basically, on for those about to rock. So here we go. What we got here for these 10 songs are, of course, it begins with the eponymous title track, which became one of the band's calling cards in a way. It became a calling card for the band. Even, I guess, next to, like, It's a Long Way to the Top, or Back in Black, or Hell's Bells, or Highway to Hell, or Let There Be Rock. It's in that pantheon of songs where it's like it's seen as their calling card. It's their anthem, and it is, to this day, is always going to get played at the shows. It's usually either at times considered an encore, because of it's such a fan favorite. That's due to the fact of the cannons and everything. So there we go. That's the first song. Then we go into Put the Finger on You, Let's Get It Up, Inject the Venom, Snowballed, Evil Walks, COD, which actually stands for Care of the Devil, Breaking the Rules, Night of the Long Knives, and then finally ending with Spellbound. So there's your 10 songs for the album. So, where do I really begin with for those about to rock? Well, let's definitely go to my sort of, I guess in a way, my relationship with the album, because I know everyone has their personal opinions of this album. Some say this was not nearly as good as Back in Black, or some say this was the beginning of the downfall for at least the 1980s for them, or at least many people say this was a beginning of just mediocre albums, because that's how everyone feels, depending on certain fan bases or whatnot, you know. Me, I've never really thought that way, because again, I really got late into AC/DC's career, because again, by the time I was born, albums like Ball Breaker and then of course Stiff Upper Lip were new albums. I was born in July 6th of 1995, and Ball Breaker didn't get released until like September. So by the time I was at least a few months old, that album was a brand new album. And then by the time I was a little bit more of a kid, very beginning to become a little more grown in 2000, Stiff Upper Lip then was the more brand new album at the time. I remember like at least that same year or a year later, again, the first time I ever saw any footage of AC/DC was on that episode of Saturday Night Live where The Rock, again Dwayne Johnson, hosted. And they played the song Stiff Upper Lip. And so that was the first time I actually seen any footage of AC/DC, and again, with Brian Johnson. So I was a kid when Brian Johnson was at least a singer, and that's what I was more used to, even though eventually I ended up getting into at least the Bon Scott stuff. So I ended up appreciating both the Brian Johnson and Bon Scott era stuff. So for me, I really am not one of those who's completely picky with the eras of AC/DC. Unless we're talking about Axl Rose, but that was only for at least live shows. That's about it. Either way, those are at least my relationship from just me growing up with at least AC/DC. By the time I think my brother had received that Family Jewels DVD as a Christmas gift, that was the beginning of me becoming so obsessed with AC/DC to where I wanted to end up getting the rest of their catalog on CD, because from there on I was then, because all I had at the time on CD was again Ball Breaker, Highway to Hell, not For Those About to Rock. This is the album. Eventually I got the sound afterwards. I'll get into that. But Flick of the Switch was I was meant to say. Then of course Let There Be Rock, and High Voltage, and Blow Up Your Video. Again, the American comp version of High Voltage. Those were your AC/DC albums that I had. And of course, I did eventually. Those were all the albums that I had. Eventually, again, after the Family Jewels set, it just took me on. It took me on a journey, basically, on just obtaining almost every single AC/DC album. And of course, also I'm forgetting that I had like Fly on the Wall and Who Made Who on cassette, but I never really listened to those albums a lot because I can't remember when I got my cassette player, but I think it had been around that time. And some of the cassettes were warped a little bit, especially Who Made Who. It didn't sound great. So, but that's all I had. So eventually, we were looking for AC/DC albums again. Apparently, again, Walmart was one of the more easier places to obtain some of their albums. So that ended up leading into getting, for example, I'm forgetting Power Edge on record and cassette. Either way, I was often then finding CD copies of that album, Fly on the Wall, Who Made Who, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, and then of course then into the Brian Johnson stuff, then even trying to get, like the Razor's Edge, and then finally Back in Black. I'd heard the song Back in Black for years up to that point, but again, I was looking for that, and Stiff Upper Lip. So those were the albums I was looking for. Then of course, For Those About to Rock. The story for this album of actually obtaining For Those About to Rock was that me and my brother were trying to really to find a copy of Power Edge. However, going to that Walmart on that one particular night, and this is a long time ago. I think again might have been 2005, maybe 6. Could have been one of those years. We were expecting to find a copy of Power Edge, but instead what I ended up finding was a copy of For Those About to Rock. And so, of course, the album didn't really interest my brother, even though I was very curious on what the actual album itself was going to at least somewhat sound. But eventually we got it, and I will say this. I liked the album, but not as much as any of the other ones I had heard. The only songs I really heard off of this album, it was only on the, besides again, for the song For Those About to Rock was Let's Get It Up. It was, of course, the live version that was recorded in, it might have been Texas, I think, or Dallas, Texas. It may have been that ended up becoming the basis for at least a music video, but it's that live version, and I always was so used to that live version because it was a little faster. It definitely rocked quite a bit, and I actually liked it. So when I finally got to actually hear the actual album version, the studio album version, it didn't sound nearly as good as the other one. It didn't sound right to me. It just sounded different. It was like, what the fuck is this? It was a little slower, and so I didn't really much care for it. And that was kind of my overall opinion of the entire album, was that it didn't nearly have as much energy as some of the previous sounds before it. Again, Back in Black had plenty of energy. Same thing into like the Bon Scott stuff. It didn't really have much of it. Even though I've now grown to really appreciate this album a little bit more, still, it's not an album that I tend to really go back to a lot. Even though I tend to, since again, I've listened to almost every single bit of my AC/DC collection, that all the albums I've listened to a lot, sometimes I get a little bit tired of. Again, I get a little bit burnt out on. So this album is at least somewhat of an album that I barely listen to a lot, so it serves as an album that kind of scratched the itch a bit. But at the time, it wasn't scratching enough of that itch. Because again, songs like Put the Finger on You, Snowballed, Evil Walks, Care of the Devil, Breaking the Rules, and Spellbound didn't do much for me. However, I really liked the song Night of the Long Knives and Inject the Venom. And of course, the title track. I really liked, those were probably the three songs I really liked from the beginning. However, again, over the years, on whenever I would revisit this album, songs like Put the Finger on You went and I'm kind of growing on me. Snowballed would get growing on me. Spellbound was one of the really earliest songs after those initial first listens. Didn't do much for me. After years of revisiting this one of the first times I did revisit For Those About to Rock, Spellbound ended up being the first song that really grew on me, to where I really can classify this song as one of my personal favorites off of For Those About to Rock. There's just something about the song I like. It's more of a slower blues song, but it does have a very nice edge to it. It's a very nice bite to it. Almost would have sounded not too out of place off of Highway to Hell, for example, because it does have a very similar feel to like Night Prowler in a way, just a little bit more faster a bit. But it has got a very cool sort of riff to it. I don't know what it is about, but I just really love this song. But the lyrics are interesting about this one because of you wouldn't think it's that interesting, but it kind of always did. For some reason, the song always kind of slightly spoke to me a little bit. It didn't feel like your typical sort of grab you between the legs kind of songs that you expect from AC/DC, but this one had more of a kind of a slight loner feel to the song. It's like it felt like it just doesn't sound like your typical sort of AC/DC song. Or almost, again, you can kind of almost think it might be one of those that could have been written by Bon Scott. And there's a very good theory that kind of supports that claim that Spellbound might have been one of the other, let's say, leftover lyrics or notes from at least that that book or whatever notebook that Bon Scott was running his ideas in, that apparently the Young Brothers were, and maybe Brian Johnson himself was probably revisiting for certain ideas on coming up with song ideas or lyrical ideas for Those About to Rock, because of apparently, since this song really deals about a person who had a very bad sort of might have been a motorcycle accident, or at least he just had a really bad accident, and it left him, seemed to really kind of left him a little bit defenseless and made him unconfident or something. It really kind of hindered his social ways or something. Again, one of the lines is that can't even start a fight. I guess because it might deal that the accident was, it might have destroyed a little bit of nerve disorder, or just made him a little to the point where he probably could not defend himself much because he was so severely hurt and whatnot. It seems to deal with that. there's a very good chance from a lot of very fan theories about that this might be about a certain incident that happened to Bon Scott. Might have been 74 or 70, maybe 73. I can't remember what specific date that people were kind of pinpointing this to. But Bon Scott apparently had a accident, a car, I think it was a motorcycle accident. And it kind of, I guess, screwed him up a little bit. It really, it left him a little injured. And that's what some people are thinking, that this song might have been, the Spellbound itself might have been about that accident. And some are thinking that this was one of those songs, again, that Bon Scott might have written before he died. So it might have been one of those ideas, but it never came to Trev. But again, since with the passing of Bon Scott, and with the fact that most of Back in Black was seen as a bit of a tribute, again, with this taking whatever was written that he had, and just combining it and still making songs that at least was just a overall eulogy to their passing friend. I think there is still some that's still somewhat left over into For Those About to Rock. So I think Spellbound might be one of those leftover songs. So again, paying more so tribute to at least to their fallen bandmate. So that's the way that tends to get looked at. Night of the Long Knives has also been an interesting one, because eventually, again, this was one of the songs I really liked growing up from this album. This one really does seem to be kind of about Hitler and such, because apparently he something he had that was called Night of the Long Knives during that World War II period. Might have been a certain group, who knows, but I know that some people try to pinpoint to the fact that Brian Johnson, I think it was either his mother or his father, that was actually, apparently that were part of the British government, that might have been one that were signed to that situation. So there might be a reason for why this song was written. So this definitely really does end up more like a Brian Johnson penned song. And it is probably one of the finest songs he probably helped write on this one, because of it's got a very cool feel to it, though I think they probably used whatever using, I think, the whole Hitler regime thing as probably an analogy for at least for anything that's probably wrong with at least dictatorship and everything in the world. So this might be seen as a song where they're kind of addressing that sort of situation. Again, this ended up becoming at least the beginning of the Reagan era, so this could be a response to at least politics. So who knows? It's very interesting, but if you look at that way and listen to actually the song, because again, they would revisit this theme anyways on Ball Breaker with the Führer. So it's kind of one of those kind of songs. Again, it's a very much still a nice sort of break from at least, again, the typical reach down in between your legs and you know what kind of songs that AC/DC were kind of known for anyways. So those are some of the interesting stuff I can bring up about the sound. But besides that, still, there really isn't a bad song on here, but not everything is great about the sound. But again, the songs I really loved off this one, again, would be the title track, Let's Get It, not really Let's Get It Up, even though I do kind of like it. I just prefer the live version. Inject the Venom, Snowballed, Night of the Long Knives, and Spellbound are my personal favorites off the sound, with at least Put the Finger on You kind of in that sort of middle there. So those are pretty much my favorite songs. Again, probably my least favorites off this one really has to be me like Evil Walks, Breaking the Rules, I think are probably my least favorite songs off of this album. But that's where I'm at. Not terrible songs, but not great either. There we go. Again, this sound did very well for them. If anything, many people will still point at Back in Black as probably their best-selling albums, but that's probably because of it ended up piggybacking off of more of the success of this album, because Back in Black never was the album that reached number one. For Those About to Rock is the first AC/DC album that actually reached number one on the United States Billboard 200 charts. That's mostly its accolade, is that this was the album that reached number one. So this was their first number one selling album for at least a while there. But anywhere else from at least 1981 to 1982, it reached number 3 on the Australian album charts. It reached number 7 on the Austrian albums chart. It reached number 2. It's probably the lowest still there that it probably has reached in the wake of its release. And it was on the album top 100 on the Dutch albums chart. It reached number 2 on the German album charts. It reached number 6 on the New Zealand albums chart. And it reached number 6 on the Norwegian albums chart. And then, of course, reached number 9 on the Swedish albums charts. So that was its position length. So it did very well for its sales. So you can't take that away. Other place again in 1982, it reached number 20 on the Austrian albums charts. Then, of course, number 30 on the German album charts, and at least in Germany. Then, of course, eventually it was then down to 43 on the U.S. Billboard 200. Again, number 43 was its position length spot. But on the wake of its early release, it was the number 1 selling album. So, again, you can say that Back in Black was a bigger selling album, but that was probably because of it ended up piggybacking off of this album's success. So, either way, Back in Black had a way to kind of make its way into the chart position, but again, it was For Those About to Rock that gained them their first. Doesn't say that it's a great album, but it really was one of the first real good accolades for this band. So, from there on, they were doing well, and at least for touring and everything. So it really was at least a pretty big album for these guys. So there we go. Again, this would serve as the final album for Robert Mutt Lange. From there on, they of course stated because of the whole recording situation, everything for this album. And again, because of how long and the fact that they were getting tired of recording this album multiple times is probably why it resulted in the performance on the actual album. Because again, they always say that the first time they actually started playing these songs in at least one of the book studios, they said they were having a blast for playing these songs. So if they recorded this stuff around the first couple of times that they were record or playing these songs, I think the album would have resulted a little more better. So again, it always depends on how an album ends up sounding. It always depends on how well the band at least are performing the songs. If they're at least are happy, they're energetic, they sound like they are enjoying themselves. That's usually going to be what you're looking for and what you're at least hearing for. It's not entirely the case on this album for the most part. So that's why you can tell that the lukewarm performance really kind of affected the everyone's opinions of this album after it was released, and that's why it always kind of went down to position spots on those charts. So there we go. That's where I'm kind of at with For Those About to Rock. Again, it is a fine album. It has reached its 4th anniversary. If you feel like are one of those that want to that feel, let's say, inspired, want to go and re-listen to For Those About to Rock, again, you can go and pull it out. Again, it's reached its 4th anniversary. And if you have any sort of opinions about For Those About to Rock, whether it be positive or negative, you can leave them in the comments section below. So, but if you haven't heard this album, it's not the first time I would gear you towards if you want to really listen to any sort of Brian Johnson era AC/DC albums, but it's not a bad album either. Again, it's probably be one of the last ones you want to listen to, especially ones from the 80s. That's personally for me. So there we go. That's it. Hope all of you enjoyed. This is Heavy Thrash. I sing I'm out, and I'll see y'all later. Take care, everyone.